Dust and pulverized concrete rained down on 4 trapped SEALs, pinned helplessly inside a flawlessly orchestrated killbox. Celebrating their imminent victory, advancing mercenaries made one catastrophic error. Nobody bothered scanning the rusted industrial skyline, where an unseen female sniper had already settled her crosshairs on their commander's chest. The abandoned industrial sector of Pripyat-adjacent Krasnovia had been quiet for 3 days. Too quiet. For Lieutenant Liam O'Connor and his 4-man Navy SEAL reconnaissance element, the silence was the heaviest thing they carried. They were moving through the skeletal remains of a Soviet-era locomotive factory, tasked with verifying the presence of a high-value rogue contractor orchestrating arms shipments across the border. O'Connor signaled a halt, his fist raised in the humid, dust-choked air. Behind him, Staff Sergeant Derek Brooks took a knee, his suppressed Mk-18 scanning the blown-out windows of the warehouse to their left. Corporal Simon Fisher, the team's medic, and Petty Officer Jackson Wyatt, their comms specialist, covered the rear. They were a ghost team, operating miles ahead of any conventional support, relying entirely on stealth and the cover of a heavily overcast sky. "Wyatt, check the SAT link," O'Connor whispered into his boom mic. "Still dead, LT," Wyatt replied, frustration bleeding through his disciplined tone. "Local interference is off the charts. We've been jammed since we crossed the rail yard." O'Connor's jaw tightened. They were blind and deaf, operating on dead reckoning. The intelligence had promised a lightly guarded cache, perhaps 6 to 8 local insurgents. But as O'Connor looked at the deliberate, funnel-like arrangement of the debris in the courtyard ahead, a cold knot formed in his stomach. The shipping containers hadn't been scattered by a bomb, they had been moved with heavy machinery. They formed a perfect horseshoe. "We need to fall back. Now," O'Connor ordered, pivoting on his heel. It was too late. The first shot didn't crack. It boomed, a heavy guttural roar of a DSHK 12.7mm heavy machine gun. The concrete pillar O'Connor had been standing next to vaporized into a cloud of razor-sharp shrapnel and pulverized stone. "Contact! Front and left flank!" Brooks roared, returning fire as he dove behind the rusted carcass of a forklift. Deafening chaos erupted. Muzzle flashes strobed from the upper gantries of the factory. It wasn't 6 insurgents. It was a platoon-sized element, moving with terrifying synchronized discipline. These weren't poorly trained militias holding their AK-47s over their heads. These were hardened mercenaries. They fired in controlled bursts, establishing interlocking fields of fire that immediately pinned O'Connor's team to the floor of the sunken loading bay. "Fisher's hit!" Wyatt yelled, dragging the medic behind a concrete barricade. Fisher was clutching his thigh, blood rapidly darkening his desert digital camouflage. "Tourniquet! Get a tourniquet on him!" O'Connor shouted over the deafening roar of incoming fire. He leaned out, firing 2 quick bursts from his rifle, dropping a mercenary who was advancing along the catwalk. But the moment he exposed himself, the heavy machine gun tracked him, chewing up the barricade and forcing him to eat dirt. A voice crackled over the team's unencrypted short-range tactical radio. It was smooth, accented, and dripping with arrogant confidence. "Lieutenant O'Connor, I know who you are. I know why you are here. And I know that nobody is coming to save you." O'Connor's blood ran cold. The enemy commander wasn't just waiting for them. He knew their identities. This was Victor Graves, a disgraced former coalition operative turned mercenary warlord. The intelligence wasn't just wrong. It was bait. "You have 2 choices, Lieutenant." Graves's voice purred over the radio, entirely unbothered by the gunfire echoing in the background. "You can bleed out in the dirt of this miserable factory, or you can throw out your weapons and surrender. I have a buyer who pays very well for Western special operators. Alive." "Go to hell, Graves," O'Connor muttered, though he knew his transmission wouldn't reach the mercenary. He looked at his team. Fisher was pale, his teeth gritted as Wyatt ratcheted the tourniquet tight. Brooks was systematically returning fire, but his magazine pouches were already looking light. They were trapped in a classic L-shaped ambush. The mercenaries held the high ground, the heavy weapons, and the numbers. Graves hadn't just sprung a trap. He had built a cage. The mercenaries began to bound forward, moving from cover to cover, tightening to the noose. They were taking their time, letting the heavy machine gun do the work of keeping the SEALs suppressed. They knew O'Connor had nowhere to go. Down in the dirt, staring at the diminishing ammunition in his rig, O'Connor prepared for the final, desperate stand. He didn't know that 1,400 yards away, hidden in the twisted steel of an abandoned crane, the variables of Graves' perfect equation were about to change. Chief Petty Officer Catherine Harrington had not moved a muscle in 14 hours. Lying prone on a rusted steel platform high above the industrial sector, she was virtually invisible. Her ghillie suit, painstakingly woven with local debris, grease and dust, made her look like nothing more than a discarded pile of rags and industrial waste. Beside her cheek rested the cold composite stock of her Macmillan TAC 338 sniper rifle, chambered in the devastating point .338 Lapua Magnum. Catherine was a ghost within the SEALs. Officially, women had only recently been integrated into the deepest tiers of special operations, but Catherine had been operating in the shadows long before the press releases. She possessed a terrifying, almost mathematical patience, and an unparalleled intuition for the geometry of battle. She had been assigned as primary overwatch for Operation Obsidian. However, 12 hours before the infiltration, she had gone directly against the mission planner's suggested hide site, a water tower 800 yards to the east. "It's too obvious," she had told the commander. "If I were setting an ambush, the water tower is the first place I'd pre-sight a mortar." Instead, she had hauled 90 pounds of gear up an unstable, rotting crane in the dead of night, positioning herself at an extreme distance. It was a grueling 1,400-yard shot to the target building, pushing the absolute limits of her rifle and the atmospheric conditions, but it gave her a panoramic view of the entire valley. Now, looking through her high-powered Schmidt and Bender optic, she watched the disaster unfold. She saw O'Connor's team get pushed into the killbox. She saw the muzzle flashes of the DSHK heavy machine gun dominating the courtyard. She watched the organized professional bounds of Graves's mercenaries. They were expected, she thought, her mind a cold, calculating machine. Graves fed us the intel. He jammed the comms. He built a fish barrel. She reached for her radio, knowing the long-range comms were jammed. She was completely cut off from command and cut off from O'Connor. If she fired, she would instantly reveal her general direction to a platoon of heavily armed men. She was completely alone, without a spotter to calculate windage or watch her back. But Catherine Harrington didn't need a spotter. She was the weapon. She shifted her eye back to the glass. Graves's men were advancing, getting ready for the final breach of the courtyard. If she didn't act within the next 60 seconds, O'Connor and his men would be slaughtered or captured. She couldn't just shoot wildly. A sniper is a psychological weapon as much as a kinetic one. She had to dismantle Graves' tactical advantage piece by piece, creating enough chaos to give O'Connor a window to escape. Target 1. The heavy machine gun. The DSHK was positioned on a third-floor balcony, raining hell on the SEALs. Catherine read the mirage rolling off the concrete below. The wind was a full-value crosswind from right to left, blowing at roughly 8 miles per hour, but the factory buildings created unpredictable eddies. She dialed the elevation turret on her scope. Data on previous engagements. 1,400 yards, 14.5 mils up. She adjusted her windage, holding 2.2 mils to the right of the gunner's head to account for the wind drift. She controlled her breathing. Inhale, exhale, pause. At the bottom of her breath, her heart rate plummeted to a steady 60 beats per minute. Her finger pressed the two-stage trigger. Crack, the rifle bucked into her shoulder, a controlled, violent surge of kinetic energy. The massive 250-grain bullet left the barrel at 2,900 feet per second. For nearly 2 full seconds, the bullet arced through the sky, crossing the vast expanse of the ruined city. Down in the kill box, Graves's gunner was laughing, thumbing the butterfly trigger of the heavy machine gun, preparing to sweep O'Connor's barricade one last time. He never heard the shot. The heavy point .338 round struck him squarely in the chest, the sheer hydrostatic shock lifting him entirely off his feet and throwing him violently backward into the shadows of the balcony. The deafening roar of the DSHK ceased instantly. Silence hung over the courtyard for a split second, heavy and confused. Up in the crane, Catherine had already cycled the bolt, the spent brass casing caught silently in a makeshift net she had rigged to the side of her rifle. She shifted her reticle. Target 2. The command node. She scanned the perimeter and spotted a mercenary standing behind a concrete pillar, holding a heavy, military-grade jamming pack. He was the reason O'Connor couldn't call for air support. Catherine held her breath. Wind adjustment, 2.5 mils. The bullet flew. The mercenary with the jammer suddenly collapsed, his equipment shattering into a shower of sparks and plastic as the round tore through the machinery and into his shoulder. Down in the dirt, Wyatt's radio suddenly screeched to life. A burst of static followed by the clear, automated ping of a satellite connection. "LT, comms are up! The jamming is dead!" Wyatt screamed, disbelief in his eyes. O'Connor looked at the balcony where the heavy machine gun had gone silent. He looked at the chaos rippling through the mercenary lines as they realized they were taking casualties from an unseen ghost. "Overwatch," O'Connor breathed, a massive wave of adrenaline hitting his system. "Harrington is out there." But the enemy was professional. The initial shock wore off in seconds. Over the open radio frequency, Graves's voice barked, no longer smooth, but laced with venom. "Sniper. Extreme distance. West. Mortars. Suppress the water tower." A moment later, a series of hollow thumps echoed through the valley. Seconds after that, the water tower 800 yards east of Catherine's position vanished in a catastrophic series of fiery explosions, the steel structure collapsing into twisted ruin. Catherine watched the water tower fall through her scope. A grim, cold smile touched her lips. She had been right. Graves had pre-sighted the obvious sniper hides. "You're smart, Graves," she whispered to herself, cycling the bolt again. "But I'm smarter." Suddenly, the glass of an abandoned office window 30 feet below her position shattered. A heartbeat later, the sharp, supersonic crack of an incoming rifle round echoed past her ear. Catherine froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs. They had a counter-sniper, and he was hunting her. She didn't move her head, only her eyes, scanning the distant rooftops through the narrow field of view of her scope. The enemy sniper knew the general direction of her shots, but he hadn't pinpointed her exact hide. He was taking speculative shots at the crane, trying to draw her fire, trying to make her flinch. If she fired to protect O'Connor's team, the muzzle flash, even suppressed, would give the enemy sniper the exact coordinates he needed to put a bullet through her optic. But if she stayed hidden, Graves's men would regroup and overrun Recon Team Alpha. The trap was far deeper than any of them had realized. It wasn't just a kill box for the Recon team. It was a snare designed to draw out and eliminate the American Overwatch. Catherine lay perfectly still, the rusted steel of the crane biting into her ribs. She had to find the needle in the haystack before he found her, and she had to do it while an entire platoon of mercenaries converged on the 4 wounded men below. The supersonic crack of the enemy sniper's bullet was still echoing off the concrete walls of the abandoned factory when Chief Petty Officer Catherine Harrington began the deadly mathematics of survival. She didn't flinch. She didn't scramble for better cover. Movement meant death. In the high-stakes chess match of counter-sniping, the first player to blink inevitably caught a bullet. Her mind raced through the ballistic data. Crack thump. She had heard the sonic boom of the bullet passing, followed a fraction of a second later by the muffled report of the rifle. The time delay told her the enemy was roughly 800 to 1,000 yards out. The angle of the shattered glass below her suggested an origin point slightly elevated, but not as high as her crane. Slowly, imperceptibly, Catherine breathed out, letting the tension bleed from her muscles. She kept her right eye glued to the Schmidt and Bender scope, scanning the staggered rooftops of the industrial sector. Down in the killbox, Lieutenant Liam O'Connor was not waiting for permission to move. The momentary silence from the heavy machine gun and the sudden restoration of their comms had given them a microscopic window. "Brooks, suppress the catwalk! Wyatt, get Fisher up! We're moving to the loading dock beneath the north gantry!" O'Connor roared, dumping his empty magazine and slamming a fresh one into his MK-18. Brooks popped up from behind the forklift, his rifle barking in rapid, controlled pairs. The mercenaries, disoriented by the sudden loss of their commander's jammer and the catastrophic death of their gunner, were a second too slow to respond. Wyatt hoisted Fisher by his webbing, practically carrying the wounded medic as they sprinted across the open asphalt. Bullets sparked and whined around them, chewing up the ground, but the withering, concentrated crossfire had been temporarily broken. They slammed into the concrete alcove beneath the loading dock, chest-heaving and covered in pulverized cement dust. "Harrington," O'Connor keyed his radio, his voice a harsh whisper. "We are repositioned at the north loading dock. We have a roof over our heads, but we are boxed in. We need an exit corridor. Over." Static hissed. Then a single calm click of a microphone button. 2 clicks meant no. 1 click meant acknowledged. Catherine couldn't speak. Her microphone was inches from her mouth, but uttering a single word would vibrate her jaw, shifting her cheek weld on the rifle stock by a millimeter. At this range, a millimeter at the rifle translated to yards off-target downrange. Furthermore, she knew the enemy sniper was hunting for any visual or auditory signature. She swept her optic across a dilapidated brick smokestack. Nothing. She checked a row of skeletal ventilation units on a warehouse roof. Nothing. Then she saw it. A subtle distortion in the air. Heat mirage. But it wasn't rolling off the tin roofs like the rest of the thermal currents. It was a localized, steady stream, venting from a dark, recessed window on the 4th floor of an administrative building, about 900 yards to her 1 o'clock. He's deep in the room, she realized. Shooting through a loophole to hide his muzzle flash, and the ambient heat of his body and rifle is drifting out the window. She dialed her magnification up to 25 times. The shadows inside the room were absolute. She couldn't see a face, a rifle barrel, or a scope glint. The enemy was a professional. He had backed away from the window, using the darkness to cloak himself, waiting for Catherine to reveal her position by firing at Graves's men again. It was a standoff. If Catherine shot at the mercenaries pressing O'Connor, the flash from her suppressed muzzle, invisible in daylight but distinct against the gloom of the overcast sky to a trained eye, would give the enemy sniper the coordinates he needed to end her life. If she didn't shoot, O'Connor's team would be overrun in minutes. Over the radio, Victor Graves's voice cut through the static, sounding strained but furious. "Assault Team 2, Breach the north dock. Burn them out. I want them finished." Catherine watched through her scope as a 6-man mercenary element stacked up behind a rusted shipping container, preparing to flank O'Connor's fragile new position. One of the men was unstrapping an M32 rotary grenade launcher. If he got within 400 yards, he could bounce 40mm grenades under the loading dock roof and wipe out Recon Team Alpha in seconds. She had to take the shot, but she had to kill the counter-sniper first. "Think," she commanded herself. "How do I make a ghost step into the light?" Her eyes darted to the environment around the administrative building. The window the enemy sniper was hiding behind was flanked by decaying plaster. Directly above it, a heavy, rusted steel beam dangled precariously from a collapsed section of the roof, held by a single, groaning cable. It was a massive gamble. Catherine adjusted her turrets. Range, 920 yards. Wind, 1.5 miles left. She bypassed the dark window entirely and placed her crosshairs directly on the rusted cable, holding the steel beam above the sniper's hide. She inhaled deeply, the humid air filling her lungs. She let it out slowly. The crosshairs settled perfectly on the frayed wire. She squeezed the trigger. The Macmillan bucked violently. The heavy .338 Magnum round crossed the distance in less than a second. It didn't strike flesh. It struck the tensioned steel cable with the force of a sledgehammer. The wire snapped with a violent, metallic twang that echoed across the valley. Deprived of its support, the massive steel beam plummeted, crashing directly into the brickwork directly above the enemy sniper's window. The concussive impact sent a blinding shower of pulverized brick, plaster dust, and rusted metal cascading directly into the room. It was a localized avalanche of debris. For a fraction of a second, human reflex overrode elite training. Through the billowing cloud of dust in the window, Catherine saw a silhouette flinch forward. The enemy sniper had jerked away from the falling debris, inadvertently exposing the matte black barrel of his rifle and the faint outline of his shoulder to the pale light of the courtyard. It was all the target Catherine needed. Her bolt flew back and forward in a blur, chambering a fresh round. She didn't have time to run the math. She relied on thousands of hours of muscle memory and instinct. She dragged her reticle down, estimated the holdover, and fired again. The bullet tore through the dust cloud. The silhouette in the window jerked violently backward and vanished into the shadows, his rifle clattering against the sill before tumbling out the window and falling 4 stories to the concrete below. The ghost was dead. The board was clear. With the counter-sniper eliminated, Catherine Harrington was no longer just a variable. She was the master of the battlefield. The heavy, oppressive silence that followed the fall of the enemy sniper's rifle was broken only by the frantic chatter on Graves's radio network. "Viper is down! I repeat, Viper is offline!" A panicked mercenary yelled. Catherine didn't hesitate. She immediately pivoted her rifle back toward the courtyard, sweeping the reticle toward the 6-man assault team, preparing to flank O'Connor with the grenade launcher. She racked the bolt, the hot brass ejecting into her net. She breathed, held, and squeezed. The mercenary carrying the M32 rotary launcher crumpled, a .338 round passing clean through his center of mass and burying itself in the asphalt. The man beside him shouted in alarm, turning to run, but Catherine was already cycling the action. 2 seconds later, he fell as well. Absolute panic seized Graves's assault element. They had believed the American sniper was suppressed or dead. Instead, she was dissecting them with terrifying methodical precision from an untouchable vantage point. The remaining 4 men broke cover, scrambling frantically for the safety of the main factory floor. "Harrington," O'Connor's voice came over the radio, laced with awe and adrenaline. "I see them breaking. We need a path to the eastern rail yard. If we can reach the tree line behind the rusted boxcars, we can vanish." Copy that, Alpha, Catherine finally spoke, her voice chillingly calm and steady over the net. Corridor is opening. Stand by. She shifted her gaze to the eastern side of the courtyard. Graves had positioned a light machine gun team behind a pile of sandbags to block that exact exit route. They were hunkered down, terrified of the unseen sniper, but their weapon was still pointed squarely at O'Connor's only path to survival. Alpha, you have an LMG blocking your 3 o'clock, Catherine reported. I am going to thread the needle. When you see the gunner drop, you have 60 seconds to cross the gap before they replace him. Acknowledge. Copy Overwatch. Ready to move, O'Connor replied. Catherine zoomed in on the sandbag emplacement. The gunner was completely behind cover, only the barrel of his weapon exposed. But Catherine wasn't aiming at the gunner. She was aiming at the cracked, concrete retaining wall directly behind him. At 1,400 yards, a standard bullet would shatter harmlessly against concrete. But Catherine was firing armor-piercing incendiary, API rounds. She adjusted her windage. Fired. The heavy round struck the concrete wall, a foot behind the entrenched gunner. The armor-piercing core dug into the stone, and the incendiary compound detonated with a blinding flash and a concussive shockwave of expanding gases and fragmented concrete. The shrapnel blasted outward in a deadly cone, directly into the unprotected backs of the LMG team. The gunner and his loader collapsed instantly, their weapons slumping forward over the sandbags. "Go, Alpha! Move!" Catherine commanded. Down in the dirt, O'Connor surged to his feet. "Push! Push! Push!" Brooks led the way, his MK-18 tracking left and right. Wyatt followed, his shoulder firmly wedged under Fisher's armpit, practically dragging the wounded medic across the open ground. O'Connor took the rear, firing suppression bursts toward the factory windows to keep Graves's remaining men pinned down. They sprinted across the ruined courtyard, completely exposed. It was a terrifying 30-second run, their boots pounding against the cracked asphalt. Inside the factory, Victor Graves realized his prize was slipping away. Driven by fury and desperation, he kicked open a reinforced steel door on the second-floor balcony, stepping out into the open with an assault rifle raised, determined to gun O'Connor down himself. "I have eyes on the HVT," Catherine whispered to herself. Graves was 1,450 yards away. He was moving fast, tracking O'Connor's sprinting form. Catherine didn't have time to dial her turrets. She used the mil dots on her reticle, holding over the target in a technique known as Kentucky windage. She tracked Graves's movement, keeping the crosshairs just ahead of his chest to account for his walking speed and the bullet's flight time. She pulled the trigger. For Victor Graves, there was no sound, no warning. He was drawing a bead on Lieutenant O'Connor's back when a devastating kinetic force struck his right shoulder, instantly severing his arm and spinning him violently onto the rusted grating of the balcony. His rifle clattered uselessly over the edge. The warlord collapsed, screaming in agony, his command structure utterly shattered. Seeing their invincible leader fall to the unseen ghost in the clouds, the remaining mercenaries completely broke rank. They abandoned their positions, fleeing deeper into the ruins of the factory, their will to fight entirely broken. Down below, O'Connor, Brooks, Wyatt, and Fisher crashed through the rusted chain-link fence and plunged into the dense, overgrown tree line of the eastern rail yard. The heavy canopy of the forest swallowed them whole. They were out of the killbox. They were safe. O'Connor leaned against a rotting oak tree, gasping for air, listening to the chaotic, retreating shouts of the mercenaries fading into the distance. He keyed his radio one last time. "Overwatch. This is Alpha. We are in the trees. We are clear. Good shooting, Chief." High above the battlefield, hidden in the twisted steel of the forgotten crane, Chief Petty Officer Catherine Harrington allowed herself a single, exhausted exhale. She carefully engaged the safety of her Macmillan, draped the camouflage netting back over the barrel, and prepared for the long, invisible descent back into the shadows. "Copy that, Alpha," she replied softly. "See you at home." The ambush at Krasnovia remains heavily classified, a phantom engagement in a shadow war. Graves's mercenary network collapsed overnight, paralyzed by the loss of their leader and the psychological terror of the unseen Guardian. Recon Team Alpha survived due to textbook tactical movement, but they owe their lives to the chilling precision of a single operator. It stands as a testament to the reality of modern combat. The most devastating weapon on the battlefield is often the one you never see.